What if one of humanity's greatest achievements wasn't the pyramids, or even Stonehenge? What if thousands of years before those famous monuments, an unknown people built a mysterious structure so advanced that it still puzzles archaeologists today? Who were they? Why was it built? And what secrets have remained buried beneath the earth for millennia? Stay with us as we uncover the astonishing story of the structure older than Stonehenge. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into history's greatest mysteries. The hill looks almost ordinary at first, a rounded swelling of earth and pale stone rising from the dry highlands of southeastern Anatolia, where the horizon opens wide and the wind moves across the grass with a slow, searching patience. There are no towering walls from a lost empire here, no fallen columns from a classical temple, no carved inscriptions naming kings, gods, battles, or laws. For a long time, this place appears to be just another mound in a landscape crowded with old traces. Farmers know the soil, shepherds know the slopes, stones lie everywhere, some sharp, some weathered, some partly buried, as if the ground itself has been trying to keep a secret. Yet beneath this quiet rise is one of the strangest discoveries in prehistory, a gathering of carved limestone pillars so ancient that they stand thousands of years before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before writing, before bronze, before almost everything that once seemed necessary for monuments to exist. The place is now known as Göbekli Tepe, a name meaning something close to Potbelly Hill, and the plain below it stretches toward the city of Şanlıurfa, near the northern edge of the Great Fertile Crescent. The name feels almost too humble for what the hill contains. Inside the mound are circular and oval stone enclosures, some of them arranged around tall T-shaped pillars, their surfaces carved with animals that seem to move through the stone even after more than 11,000 years. Foxes bend along the sides of the pillars, snakes ripple in silent lines, boars, birds, scorpions, and other creatures appear not as decoration in the modern sense, but as signs from a world whose meanings are partly lost. The stones do not explain themselves. They do not offer a written message. They simply stand there older than the familiar architecture of civilization, asking the same question again and again in a language made of weight, labor, and memory. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead does not begin with palaces or armies. It begins with people who are often imagined as wandering bands at the edge of survival, moving with the seasons, hunting wild animals, gathering plants, watching water sources, reading tracts, winds and skies with the seriousness of people whose lives depend on attention. Yet here on a limestone ridge, those people, or people very much like them, carve monumental pillars, shape enclosures, organize labor, and return again and again to a place that appears to matter deeply. What survives in the record suggests something more complex than the older image of simple hunter-gatherers waiting for farming to begin. At Göbekli Tepe, the line between wandering and settlement, between survival and ceremony, between practical life and symbolic life begins to blur. The age alone is enough to unsettle old assumptions. The earliest monumental structures at the site date to the pre-pottery Neolithic, roughly between the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era. This is a world emerging from the long shadow of the Ice Age. The climate is changing. Wild cereal grasses grow across parts of the region. Herds of gazelle, wild cattle, wild sheep, and other animals move through open landscapes and seasonal corridors. Human groups are beginning to gather in new ways, sometimes staying longer in favored places, sometimes experimenting with plants long before agriculture becomes the settled foundation of village life. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad picture is clear enough to be startling. The people connected to this hill are not building after the rise of kingdoms. They are building before pottery becomes common, before metal tools, before wheeled vehicles, before domesticated draft animals can drag stone across the ground. That is what makes the hill feel so heavy with contradiction. A monument is usually imagined as the product of surplus authority and settled life. A ruler commands, farmers provide food, specialists carve, labourers, hall scribes, record priests explain. But Göbekli Tepe seems to belong to a time before that familiar machinery exists. Its pillars are not small markers placed casually in the ground. Some are several metres high and weigh many tons. They are cut from local limestone shaped with stone tools moved from quarries raised upright and arranged with care. The effort requires planning, it requires cooperation, it requires people to do something that is not immediately necessary for eating, sleeping, or escaping danger. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The hill preserves not just stone architecture, but a turning point in how humans begin to make shared meaning visible. The surrounding landscape deepens the mystery because it is not empty. It is part of Upper Mesopotamia, a region where many early Neolithic sites reveal communities experimenting with settlement, food processing architecture and ritual life. Göbekli Tepe does not stand outside human development, like a miracle dropped from nowhere. It belongs to a larger world of change. Yet it still feels exceptional because of its scale, its imagery, and the force with which it challenges the old sequence of civilization. For decades, the familiar story ran in a clean order. First people farmed, then they settled, then villages grew, then temples and monuments appeared. Göbekli Tepe complicates that order. It suggests that gathering around powerful symbolic places may have helped pull people together before farming fully transformed them. Scholars still debate how far that idea should be taken, and newer research has made the picture more complicated, but the old certainty has not survived untouched. Standing on the hill, it is easy to understand why ancient people might have noticed the place. The ridge commands a broad view of the surrounding plain. The sky feels large. The ground offers limestone that can be cut and shaped. From a distance, the mound rises gently, but from within it stone rings and buried walls reveal repeated acts of construction. The builders are not merely reacting to the landscape, they are changing it. They are taking natural stone from the ridge and turning it into body signs, boundaries, and perhaps presences. The T-shaped pillars are especially haunting because many appear almost human without becoming fully human. Some have carved arms and hands along their sides, suggesting stylized bodies, though the heads are absent or abstracted into the broad top of the T. They stand like figures whose faces have been withheld. There is something powerful in that restraint. Later civilizations often cover their sacred places with names, myths, royal claims, and images of gods. Here the meaning is quieter and harder to seize. The carvings show animals, but they are not simple scenes of daily hunting. They may refer to danger spirit memory, clan identity, death, seasonality, or stories that vanished long before writing could preserve them. The animals are wild, not domesticated. They belong to the world around the builders, but also to a mental landscape that cannot be reconstructed with certainty. A fox carved in stone is not just a fox once thousands of years have passed. It becomes a clue without a key. For a long time the hill hides this complexity under its own debris. That is one of the strangest features of the site. Parts of Göbekli Tepe were buried in antiquity, filled with stones, soil, animal bones and debris. Whether this filling was deliberate closure, rebuilding, practical leveling, ritual transformation, or a mixture of actions remains debated. but the result is extraordinary. The act that conceals the monument also helps preserve it. The buried pillars wait while the world above changes again and again. Farming spreads, villages grow, cities rise, temples become institutions. Kings begin to carve their own messages into stone. Empires cross the lands of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Languages appear, flourish, and disappear. The hill remains quiet, its oldest stones sealed inside the earth like a memory placed beyond ordinary time. When modern archaeology finally begins to understand what lies beneath the mound, the discovery does not simply add one more ancient monument to the list. It forces a reconsideration of the deep human past. The question is not only how old the structure is. The question is what kind of people could imagine it, organize it, build it, and return to it in a world where civilization as usually defined has not yet arrived. The answer cannot be reduced to one dramatic claim. Göbekli Tepe is not proof of a lost advanced empire despite the popular stories that sometimes gather around it. It is not a message from a vanished super-civilization. The evidence points instead to something more fascinating and more human communities at the edge of a new way of living, capable of immense cooperation, symbolic imagination and social complexity long before history begins to write itself down. The hill beneath the dust therefore becomes a kind of threshold. On one side is the older world of mobile foragers, Ice Age survivors, wild landscapes, and knowledge carried in memory rather than in script. On the other side is the long Neolithic transformation that eventually leads to farming villages, permanent architecture, social hierarchy, and the distant foundations of urban civilization. Göbekli Tepe stands between these worlds without belonging neatly to either. Its stones do not tell a simple story of progress. They suggest a more tangled beginning where belief, labor, landscape, and gathering may have shaped human history as powerfully as grain fields and storage pits. The structure, older than Stonehenge, is not only remarkable because it is ancient. It is remarkable because it reveals that people were building worlds of meaning before they built the world that modern history knows how to describe. Long before the stones of Göbekli Tepe rise from the ridge, the world around them is changing in ways no single person can see from beginning to end. The Ice Age is loosening its grip not in one clean moment, but through uneven centuries of warming, cooling, drying, greening, retreat and return. Glaciers still dominate distant northern landscapes, but in southwestern Asia, the rhythms of life are shifting. The air grows more forgiving in some periods, harsher in others. Grasslands expand and contract. Wild cereal plants spread across favoured zones, their seeds ripening in seasonal abundance. Herd animals follow grazing routes across open country. Human groups move with deep knowledge of this living map, carrying not only tools and fire but stories, obligations, memories and relationships with places that may have mattered for generations. This is the late Ice Age and the early Holocene, a borderland in time. It is not yet the world of cities, kings, written laws or ploughed fields stretching under the authority of states. It is also not a world of simple wandering as older accounts sometimes imagined. People of this period are skilled, observant, and socially connected across landscapes larger than any one camp. They know stone, bone, wood, hide, fibre, pigment, season, migration, and weather. They understand which plants can be eaten, which can be stored, which can heal, which can poison, and which appear briefly after rain. They know where animals pass in spring, where water hides in summer, where shelter holds warmth in winter. Their world is mobile, but it is not aimless. In the lands around Göbekli Tepe, these communities live near one of the most important ecological crossroads on Earth. The Fertile Crescent is not a single garden waiting quietly to be discovered. It is a vast arc of hills, plains, rivers and uplands, where wild ancestors of wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs exist within reach of human hands. But that does not mean agriculture appears automatically. Domestication is not a switch that turns on because useful species are nearby. It is a long relationship full of accidents, experiments, choices, failures, and unintended consequences. For generations, people harvest wild grasses without becoming farmers. They hunt wild sheep without owning herds. They gather in places that later become villages without yet living exactly as villagers do. The people who move through this region are heirs to a long human story. Modern humans have already spread across much of the world. They have endured cold periods, shifting coastlines, changing animal populations, and the disappearance of other human relatives. By the time Göbekli Tepe begins to matter, humans are not new creatures stumbling into symbolic thought. They have been making ornaments, burying the dead in meaningful ways, painting, carving, trading materials, and creating social identities for tens of thousands of years. What changes here is not the sudden birth of imagination. The change is the scale at which imagination becomes anchored to a place. In earlier periods, meaning can travel with people. A carved object can be carried. A memory can be told beside a fire. A ritual can be repeated in different camps along a seasonal route. At Göbekli Tepe and sites like it, something else begins to happen. Meaning becomes heavy. It becomes limestone. It becomes a place that demands return. This does not mean everyone settles permanently beside it at first. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how people used the site during its earliest phases. Yet the very existence of the enclosures suggests gatherings that are larger, more organized, and perhaps more socially intense than ordinary daily camps. People are not only surviving in the landscape, they are marking one part of it as different. The wider world of this period contains hints of that transformation. In parts of the Levant, earlier Natufian communities had already begun living for longer periods in substantial settlements, gathering wild cereals, grinding seeds, and burying their dead near habitation areas. Their way of life shows that the road toward farming and village life is not straight. It includes experiments in staying, storing, returning, and remembering. Farther north in Upper Mesopotamia, communities develop their own versions of this transition. Some places show early architecture, some reveal special buildings, some preserve evidence of feasting, burial craft, and shared labor. Göbekli Tepe belongs to this shifting world, but it pushes one aspect of it to an extraordinary extreme. The landscape itself may help explain why. The limestone ridge offers both visibility and material. From its slopes, people can look across broad distances. The site is not hidden in a valley where only a small group might stumble upon it. It occupies a position that can gather attention. Below and around it, wild resources once exist in seasonal abundance. Gazelle herds likely move through the region. Wild cereals grow on nearby slopes and plains. Pistachio, almond, and other useful plants may be found in the broader environment. The ancient world here is not effortless, but it is rich enough in certain seasons to support gatherings, especially if people know when and how to arrive. Gathering changes everything. A small band can make decisions through familiarity, kinship, and daily negotiation. A larger gathering requires other forms of coordination. Food must be acquired in greater amounts. Work must be organized. Conflicts must be managed. Stories must be shared widely enough to bind people who do not live together every day. This may be one of the keys to Göbekli Tepe, though no single explanation fully accounts for it. The site may not represent a settled town in the later sense, but it may represent a powerful center where scattered groups come together, renew alliances, perform rituals, exchange knowledge, find partners, remember the dead, or define themselves through shared symbols. Such gatherings would not have been quiet academic events. They would have been alive with movement, smell, tension, and effort. Fires burn, meat roasts, stone tools strike limestone. People carry water skins, baskets, and wood. Hunters return with animals. Others grind seeds or prepare food. Children watch adults work in ways they do not yet understand. Older people remember earlier visits to the same ridge. Newcomers see the pillars for the first time and feel the force of a place already shaped by many hands. What survives in the record suggests feasting and repeated activity, but the human experiences behind those traces can only be inferred. Archaeology finds bones, tools, stone chips, walls, and seeds. It does not recover the full sound of a crowd at sunset. The late Ice Age world also carries instability. Climate shifts at the end of the Pleistocene are not gentle background changes. The Younger Dryas, a cold and dry interval before the full warmth of the Holocene, affects environments across many regions. Its local impacts are complex and still debated, but it belongs to the broader story of uncertainty, in which human communities adjust to changing water plants and animal patterns. In such conditions, places of gathering may become even more important. They can hold information, they can hold alliances, they can provide a setting where groups respond socially to ecological pressure. The building of monumental structures may therefore reflect not leisure after abundance, but a strategy of connection during transformation. This is where Göbekli Tepe begins to alter the older story of civilization. It stands before the fully developed farming village, yet it already shows planning, cooperation, symbolism, and place-based identity. It does not prove that religion created agriculture in any simple way. It does not prove that monuments came before all settlement everywhere. The evidence is too varied for that. But it does suggest that human beings were capable of organizing around shared sacred or symbolic landscapes before the classic markers of civilization appeared. The old sequence becomes less like a staircase and more like a web with ritual, food, memory, climate, and cooperation all pulling on one another. Before villages become cities, before temples become institutions, before grain becomes tax and labor becomes law. There is this earlier and stranger moment, people moving through a changing world, gathering on a hill, cutting stone from the earth, and beginning to build something that outlasts every name they ever knew. They do not live in prehistory, because their lives are empty of history. They live in prehistory, because no writing survives to speak for them. The stones become their most durable witnesses, and even they speak only in fragments. The people who raise the pillars of Göbekli Tepe do not inherit a world of iron chisels, bronze blades, pulley systems, carts, ox teams, or written plans scratched onto tablets. Their tools come from stone, bone, wood, fibre, and patience. Their strength comes from bodies trained by a life of movement, carrying climbing, cutting, grinding, hunting, gathering, and building shelters from what the land provides. To modernize, the missing technologies are almost the first thing noticed. There is no metal to bite easily into limestone. There is no wheel to roll heavy blocks across the ridge. There are no domesticated cattle teams to pull the stones upright. Yet the pillars stand, and their existence proves that the builders possess something just as important as advanced machinery: organization, skill, shared purpose, and time directed toward a task larger than any single household. The limestone itself is local, which matters greatly. The builders are not hauling stone from a distant mountain range across impossible terrain. They're working with the ridge beneath and around the site where bedrock can be cut and shaped. In nearby quarry areas, archaeologists have found unfinished pillars and traces suggesting how the work may have begun. A pillar starts as part of the living rock. Workers define its outline by cutting channels around it. probably using hard stone tools to strike peck scrape and fracture the softer limestone. The process is slow, noisy, and physically demanding. Blow after blow removes small pieces, dust gathers in the channels, hands toughen, tools break and are replaced. The stone is not conquered quickly, it is persuaded through repetition. One lesser-known detail is that the T-shape is not only an artistic choice after the block is free, it must be planned from the beginning. The broad head and narrower shaft require careful shaping, while the stone remains partly attached to the bedrock. A mistake can ruin weeks or months of work. The builders need to understand the stone's weaknesses, the direction of cracks, the best moment to separate the pillar from the quarry floor, and the risk of breaking it before it reaches its destination. The evidence remains incomplete because the tools and methods are reconstructed from Mark's unfinished pieces, experiments, and comparison with other stoneworking traditions. But what survives in the record suggests practical intelligence of a very high order. These are not people casually dragging rocks into circles. They are specialists in a craft that has no written manual. Moving the pillars may have required teams using ropes, wooden beams, sledges, prepared surfaces, and coordinated pulling. The exact methods remain debated. Since the limestone sources are closed, the task is possible without later machinery, but possible does not mean easy. A multi-ton pillar still demands planning. It must be freed from the quarry, shifted without snapping, transported across uneven ground, manoeuvred into an enclosure, and raised into position. Every stage contains danger. A stone that falls can crush a worker. A rope can snap. A slope can turn a controlled movement into disaster. If the builders use wooden rollers or sledges, those objects decay and vanish, leaving little direct evidence. Archaeology often sees the stone result but not the vanished wooden intelligence that made the result possible. Raising a pillar upright is its own challenge. A pit or socket may be prepared. The stone may be tipped, levered, pulled, braced and stabilized with smaller stones and fill. People must move together. Commands may be shouted, sung, gestured, or understood through practice, though no voice survives. The effort would create a powerful social scene. Dozens of people might pull in rhythm, while others steady the block wedge stones beneath it or watch for danger. The moment the pillar rises could carry practical relief and symbolic force at the same time. A dead weight becomes a standing presence. A piece of bedrock becomes something like a figure. Labour turns landscape into memory. The carvings add another layer of skill. Once the pillar surface is shaped, animals are cut in relief or incised into the stone. Some carvings are shallow and linear, while others stand out more boldly from the surface. Foxes, snakes, birds, boars, scorpions, and other creatures appear with a confidence that suggests experienced hands. The artists are not merely copying nature. They select, simplify, exaggerate, and position the animals in ways that seem deliberate. A snake may run vertically. A fox may occupy the side of a pillar. Birds may appear with long legs or dramatic profiles. Some images cluster together, creating relationships that are no longer readable with certainty. Scholars still debate whether these animals represent myths, social groups, seasonal signs, dangerous powers, or something entirely different. What can be said is that the carvings are not random scratches. They belong to a visual system. It is tempting to imagine the builders as a single unified community, but the site may have drawn people from different groups across a wider region. If so, the labour behind the pillars becomes even more remarkable. Cooperation between groups requires trust, obligation, leadership, or shared belief strong enough to bring bodies together for difficult work. Leadership in this world may not look like kingship. It may be temporary negotiated ritual, elder-based, reputation-based, or attached to those who control knowledge of ceremonies, seasons, or stone. No single explanation fully accounts for how authority functions here. There are no royal graves at the site identifying rulers. There are no written titles. The organization is visible only through the work itself. Food is part of that organization. People who spend long days quarrying, carving, hauling, and raising stones must eat. Others must supply them. Hunting, gathering, grinding, cooking, carrying water, and preparing meals become part of the monument as surely as carving does. Later sections of the story reveal more about feasting and food, but even here at the level of construction the connection is unavoidable. Monumental labour creates social demands. It gathers, people consumes energy, and turns cooperation into something visible. A pillar is not just limestone, it is stored effort. It is the trace of meals, eaten tools, broken muscles strained, and agreements kept. The absence of metal often leads modern observers to underestimate this kind of work. Yet human history is filled with impressive stone achievements made without modern machinery. What makes Göbekli Tepe distinctive is not that heavy stone can never be moved by pre-metal communities, it plainly can. The deeper surprise is that this happens so early in a society still tied strongly to hunting and gathering lifeways. The builders do not need cities to organize themselves. They do not need writing to remember forms. They do not need domesticated oxen to imagine height. Their technology is not primitive in the sense of being thoughtless. It is appropriate to their world, refined through experience, and capable of producing results that still unsettle expectations after 11 millennia. In the end, the hands that raise the pillars remain anonymous but not invisible. They survive in tool marks, quarry scars, carved animals, sockets, walls, and the sheer fact of alignment. Their labour shows that the boundary between survival and symbolism is much thinner than it once appeared. These people hunt and gather, but they also plan in stone. They follow animals, but they also carve animals into pillars that may outlast every herd they ever tracked. They live before recorded history, but they are not waiting for history to begin. On the ridge above the plain, they are already making a world that can hold memory after the makers are gone. The most unsettling possibility at Göbekli Tepe is not simply that people built with stone earlier than expected. It is that they may have gathered around a powerful ceremonial landscape before the full rise of settled village life, before farming becomes the dominant foundation of society, and before the familiar machinery of temples, rulers, and organized religion appears in the historical record. For a long time, the older model of civilization seemed almost comfortable in its order. People learned to farm. Farming created surplus. Surplus allowed larger settlements. Larger settlements produced specialists, leaders, priests, and monuments. In that sequence, temples stood near the end of a long chain. Göbekli Tepe does not destroy the entire chain, but it bends it sharply. It suggests that shared belief and ritual obligation may have helped gather people together before permanent towns fully shaped their lives. This does not mean the hill was entirely isolated from habitation. Archaeology in the region has become more nuanced, and scholars still debate how people lived around the site, how often they came, and whether domestic activity existed closer than once assumed. The old image of a temple standing alone in the wilderness may be too simple. Yet the earliest and most famous enclosures at Göbekli Tepe still do not look like ordinary houses. They are not built for sleeping families storing household goods or sheltering daily routines. Their scale arrangement, carved imagery, and central pillars suggest a special purpose. What survives in the record points toward a place of gathering performance memory and perhaps ritualized encounter, even if the exact nature of that ritual remains beyond reach. The phrase sacred place can be useful, but it must be handled carefully. It is easy to place later religious ideas onto much older people and imagine temples, priests' doctrines and gods in forms that belong to historical civilizations. Göbekli Tepe comes from a world before writing, so there is no surviving theology to explain the pillars. No text says who the T-shaped figures represent. No inscription identifies a ceremony. No carved calendar labels the animals. The evidence remains incomplete, and the word sacred may cover many possibilities: ancestor presence, seasonal gathering, initiation, death rites, mythic storytelling, social alliance, dangerous powers, or the marking of identity among groups. The structure may have held meanings that do not fit neatly into modern categories of religion, politics, art, or community. Even so, the architecture feels deliberately separated from ordinary use. The enclosures create interior spaces defined not by the practical needs of daily shelter, but by arrangement and focus. Central pillars stand in pairs with smaller pillars set into surrounding walls. The T-shaped forms, sometimes with carved arms and hands, give the impression of stylized beings facing inward or occupying the space with silent authority. They are not statues in the later classical sense, but they are not merely supports either. They seem to organize attention. Anyone entering such an enclosure would be drawn toward them, aware of their height, their surfaces, their animal imagery, and the weight of labor that brought them upright. If these spaces were used for gatherings, the experience would have been intense. The enclosure walls may have limited movement and sight. People might enter from one side, pass close to carved figures, and stand beneath pillars taller than themselves. Firelight could change the surfaces after sunset, making snakes seem to ripple and foxes seem to lean from the stone. The smell of smoke bodies, dust, and roasted meat may have mixed with the dryness of limestone. This is not proof of a specific ritual, but it reminds us that prehistoric architecture is lived through the senses. A structure does not need writing to shape behavior. It can guide where people stand, what they see, how they move, and what they remember. One lesser-known feature of the wider Göbekli Tepe world is that special buildings appear at other early Neolithic sites in the region, suggesting that communal or ritual architecture is not a single isolated accident. Places such as Nevala, Chorikarahan Tepe, and other sites in the Tash Tepela region show that southeastern Anatolia contains a broader tradition of symbolic construction during this deep period. Each site has its own character, and direct comparisons must be cautious, but together they suggest a landscape in which communities experiment with stone gathering and meaning, at a scale once thought unlikely for hunter-gatherer or early Neolithic groups. Göbekli Tepe is exceptional, but it is not floating outside history. The idea that ritual gathering could help drive settlement is powerful, because it changes what counts as a cause in human history. Food is essential, but people do not live by calories alone. Groups also need trust marriage networks, shared stories, obligations, status, memory, and ways to manage conflict. A place like Göbekli Tepe may have helped create or reinforce those social bonds. Building together makes relationships visible. Feasting together turns strangers or distant kin into participants in a shared event. Returning to the same hill across generations transforms landscape into tradition. In this sense, ritual is not an extra decoration added after survival is secured. It may be one of the tools by which survival itself becomes socially organized. This possibility must not be exaggerated into a simple claim that religion invented farming. The evidence does not support such certainty. Agriculture emerges through many interacting pressures: climate shifts, plant availability, population patterns, settlement habits, storage, risk management, and human experimentation across different regions. No single explanation fully accounts for it. Yet Göbekli Tepe shows that symbolic life and communal labor are part of the same transformation. People may have come to the hill for reasons that were emotional, spiritual, social, seasonal, or political in the broadest sense. Once gathered, they needed food. They may have intensified the use of wild cereals, hunted animals in large numbers, exchanged knowledge about plants, and strengthened connections that later helped make more settled lifeways possible. The structure also challenges the way modern observers define complexity. Complexity is often measured through cities' writing classes, administration, and agriculture. Göbekli Tepe belongs to an earlier kind of complexity, one harder to see because it leaves fewer familiar records. It is complexity without bureaucracy, monumentality without king's coordination, without document symbolism, without translation. Such complexity may be temporary, seasonal, or event-based, rather than permanently urban. It may appear during gatherings and then disperse across the landscape. Archaeology has often been better at recognizing permanent settlement than temporary congregation, because houses, storage pits, and village layers leave different traces. Göbekli Tepe makes the temporary feel monumental. A sacred place without a town is therefore not a contradiction if the town is not the only possible centre of human life. A hill can be a centre. A quarry can be a centre. A burial ground, a spring, a migration crossing, or a place visible from far away can hold communities together in ways that do not require streets and permanent walls. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may still move across the land, but their movement has anchors. They may not live year-round beside the pillars, but the pillars belong to their world as surely as water sources and hunting routes do. The site suggests that belonging can be built before settlement hardens into a village. By raising these stones, people create a place that stands apart from daily necessity, while remaining deeply connected to it. They mark a ridge as meaningful. They make labour into ceremony, and ceremony into landscape. They leave behind no explanation, only the form of their attention. That is why Göbekli Tepe remains so difficult and so compelling. It asks modern history to imagine a beginning in which civilization does not rise first from fields and storehouses alone, but also from gathering symbols and the human need to make certain places matter more than others. The animals carved into the stones of Göbekli Tepe do not behave like ordinary decoration. They do not sit quietly as background patterns, nor do they form simple hunting scenes that can be read at a glance. They appear with a strange force, isolated, repeated, crowded, stretched, and placed along pillars, as if the stone itself has become a surface where the wild world presses close to human thought. Foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, wild cattle, and other creatures emerge from the limestone, each one shaped by hands that know the animal body but are not merely copying what the eye sees. Some are elegant and controlled. Others feel tense, dangerous, almost abrupt. Together they create one of the oldest and most mysterious symbolic landscapes ever carved into monumental stone. The first thing to notice is that these animals are wild. They belong to the world before domestication becomes dominant, before sheep and goats are managed in herds, before cattle are enclosed as wealth, before pigs become part of village economies. The carved creatures are not calm barnyard animals. They are beings encountered in open country, in brush, in wetlands, on slopes, in darkness, in flight, in death, and in danger. A boar is not just meat. It is tusk, speed, aggression, and risk. A snake is not just a line. It is hidden movement, poison, renewal, fear, and sudden appearance. A vulture is not just a bird. It is a creature of the dead circling above bodies, descending where life has ended. Scholars still debate whether these meanings were close to what the builders intended, but the choice of animals suggests a world where humans define themselves in relation to powerful non-human presences. The fox is among the most memorable figures at Göbekli Tepe. Its long body and sharp profile appear on several pillars, sometimes placed vertically along the stone. In later folklore across many cultures, Foxes often become clever, liminal, unsettling creatures, but it would be careless to project later stories directly onto this Neolithic world. Still, the animal's repeated presence suggests significance. It may represent a clan marker, a mythic, being a spirit-like figure, a season, a hunted animal, a trickster-like presence, or something that does not fit modern categories. What survives in the record suggests importance without translation. The fox is clear as an image and opaque as a message. Snakes appear even more frequently, and their forms are especially suited to stone carving. A snake can become a line, a boundary, a motion, across a pillar, a cluster of movement, or a sign of danger. Some carvings show multiple snakes together, creating an effect that is almost rhythmic. Their bodies may slide downward, curl, or gather near other symbols. In a world without writing, repeated animal forms may carry meanings that are both visual and social. They could be remembered through stories, gestures, ceremonies, or restrictions. The evidence remains incomplete, but repetition rarely feels accidental in a place that required so much labour. Birds add another layer. Some long-legged birds resemble cranes or water birds, though identification is not always certain. Their presence points beyond the dry hilltop to wetlands, rivers, marsh edges, and seasonal habitats in the wider region. One of the most discussed images from the site and related early Neolithic contexts involves vultures and headless human imagery, though interpretation is complex and debated. Across the broader ancient Near East, vultures sometimes appear in relation to death exposure or transformation, but again direct certainty is impossible. At Göbekli Tepe, birds may connect sky-death movement and memory. They may also simply represent creatures that carried strong meaning for people whose lives unfolded under open horizons. The scorpion is perhaps the most immediately unsettling animal carved at the site. Its raised tail and compact body make it recognizable and difficult to ignore. For people living close to the ground, sleeping, working, and moving through stone and brush, the scorpion is a real danger. Its image may mark fear, protection, warning power, or a story now lost. Dangerous animals often become symbolically important because they occupy the boundary between ordinary life and sudden harm. A scorpion's small size does not reduce its force. In stone it becomes larger than the creature itself, transformed into a sign of concentrated threat. One surprising detail is that the animals are often shown without obvious human dominance over them. This is not a monument filled with triumphant hunters displaying mastery over nature. Humans are strangely absent or disguised, while animals dominate the visual field. The T-shaped pillars may themselves represent stylized human or superhuman figures, especially where arms, hands, belts, or clothing-like details appear. If so, then the animals surround or accompany these beings rather than merely serving as prey. This creates a charged relationship between human-like forms and wild creatures. The site may be presenting a world where humans, animals, ancestors, and unseen forces are not sharply separated. The carvings also raise questions about memory. In oral societies, images can help hold stories in place. A carved animal may not explain a myth to an outsider, but it can activate memory for those who already know the story. A fox on a pillar, a snake along a wall, a vulture near a human-like sign may have worked like visual anchors for narratives, performed, recited, danced, or enacted within the enclosure. No single explanation fully accounts for the imagery, but it is unlikely that the builders carved such creatures only to make the stones attractive. The animals may have helped structure ceremonies, mark group identities, record cosmological ideas, or summon the presence of beings that mattered deeply. The placement of the carvings matters as much as the animals themselves. Some appear on the broad faces of pillars, others on the sides, some low, some higher, some interacting visually with other forms. A person moving through the enclosure would not see all images at once. The carvings might reveal themselves gradually as bodies turned, fires shifted, or ceremonies unfolded. This means the architecture and imagery work together. The stones do not merely display symbols, they choreograph encounter. A visitor might pass one animal stand beneath another, face the central pillars, and feel surrounded by a world that is both familiar and transformed. Modern viewers often want the animals to become a code, as if one perfect key could unlock the entire site. Popular theories sometimes try to turn the carvings into star maps, catastrophe records, or messages of a lost advanced culture. Such interpretations are usually disputed or unsupported when they go beyond the archaeological evidence. The more grounded mystery is already profound enough. The animals show that the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed a rich symbolic system, but that system was not designed for distant readers thousands of years later. It was made for people who knew the stories, fears, seasons, and relationships behind the forms. The wild creatures cut into the limestone therefore preserve a world at the edge of speech and silence. They are recognizable enough to feel close, but mysterious enough to remain unreachable. They tell us that the people of the hill were not only builders and organizers, they were observers of animal behavior, makers of images, keepers of stories, and participants in a symbolic universe where the boundary between daily life and deeper meaning may have been thin. The animals still move through the stone because the meanings that held them there have vanished, leaving only the tension between what can be seen and what cannot be known. The hill does not contain only one circle of stones, and this is one of the details that changes the scale of the mystery. Göbekli Tepe is often imagined through a single image, two tall T-shaped pillars standing at the center of a round enclosure, surrounded by smaller pillars and carved animals, as if one ancient chamber alone could explain the whole site. But the mound is much larger than that. Beneath the surface are multiple enclosures, walls quarry, traces, fills, and construction phases layered across time. The famous circles are not isolated accidents. They belong to a landscape of repeated building, alteration, burial, and return, suggesting that the hill remains important across generations rather than during one brief moment of inspiration. This matters because a single monument can sometimes be explained as an extraordinary event, a one-time project, created by a sudden gathering or a charismatic leader. A complex of enclosures is different. It implies memory. It implies tradition. It suggests that people come back to the same ridge not merely because stone is available, but because the place has become woven into their social world. One group may begin a structure, another may modify it, and later people may build nearby, fill older spaces, or create new ones with slightly different forms. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern points toward continuity rather than accident. Göbekli Tepe is not only a structure older than Stonehenge, it is a buried archive of repeated human attention. Archaeologists have identified several major enclosures, often labelled with letters, each with its own arrangement and character. Some are large and carefully built with central pillars rising above the surrounding ring. Others are smaller or belong to later phases where the architecture changes. The earliest monumental enclosures tend to be the most dramatic, but the later remains are just as important because they show that the site does not freeze in one form. Over time, building practices shift. Large circular or oval spaces give way in some areas to smaller, more rectangular rooms or structures. The meaning of this change is debated, but it may reflect broader transformations in Neolithic life, including settlement patterns, social organization, and changing forms of ritual. The mound itself is partly artificial, built up through human action. What looks like a natural hill is in part the accumulated result of stone walls, debris fill collapsed material and ancient labour. This is why the site remained hidden so long. The monuments were not standing openly for later peoples to admire or reuse in obvious ways. They were swallowed by the very deposits that formed the mound. As centuries passed, the once open spaces became sealed, and the surface softened into a rounded rise. Farmers encountered stones, but the true arrangement below remained mostly invisible. The hill became a container for its own past. One lesser-known aspect of the site is how much remains unexcavated. Modern archaeology does not simply strip away a whole mound to satisfy curiosity. Excavation is slow, destructive, and irreversible even when done carefully. Once a layer is removed, it cannot be put back in its original condition. For that reason, much of Göbekli Tepe is studied through survey geophysical methods, limited excavation, and careful conservation. The hidden enclosures beneath the ground may outnumber the ones already exposed. This means that the public image of the site is only a portion of the ancient reality. The most famous pillars are not the full story. They are windows into a much larger buried landscape. The spaces already uncovered show a careful relationship between architecture and attention. The central pillars dominate the enclosures, while smaller pillars set into surrounding walls create a ring of presences. Benches or low interior features in some areas suggest that people may have sat, stood, moved, or gathered around the inner space in structured ways. The floors, often prepared and smoothed, suggest repeated use. The walls are not random piles of stone, but built boundaries that separate inside from outside. Even without roofs, these spaces create a sense of enclosure. They turn open landscape into a controlled environment, where site movement and perhaps ceremony are shaped by architecture. At the same time, the site is not uniform. Each enclosure has differences in layout, carving size, and condition. Some pillars carry striking animal reliefs, others are plainer. Some imagery seems concentrated in particular areas. This variation may indicate different groups, different phases, different meanings, or changing traditions. Scholars still debate how to interpret the differences. It is possible that each enclosure held its own story identity or ritual focus. It is also possible that some differences are practical, caused by available labour stone quality or rebuilding choices. No single explanation fully accounts for the patterns, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the site so valuable. It resists being reduced to one easy model. The mountain of hidden enclosures also changes how the builders themselves are imagined. They're not only capable of raising one impressive set of pillars, they're capable of sustaining a tradition of monumental construction across time. That requires transmission of knowledge. Someone must teach where to quarry, how to shape, how to move, how to raise, how to carve, how to arrange stones and which forms matter. Children or younger adults may watch older builders and later become builders themselves. Techniques pass through bodies and memory. The site becomes a school of stone without writing, a place where practical craft and symbolic knowledge are inherited together. The wider region strengthens this impression. Göbekli Tepe is now understood within a broader network of early Neolithic sites in southeastern Turkey, some of which also contain monumental or symbolically rich architecture. This does not make the hill less extraordinary. It makes it more historically grounded. The builders belong to a regional world in which communities are experimenting with new forms of gathering, building, and meaning. The ridge above the plain may be one powerful centre among several parts of a landscape where different places hold different roles. What survives in the record suggests that early monumental construction is not a lone spark, but part of a wider fire spreading through human society at the dawn of the Neolithic. Yet the hiddenness of the mound keeps the story from becoming too clear. For every exposed pillar, others remain beneath the earth. For every carved animal there may be missing images still sealed in fill. For every enclosure mapped there may be structures whose purpose is unknown. Archaeology advances by uncovering but also by leaving enough intact for future methods. The hill still withholds most of itself. This is fitting because Göbekli Tepe has always been a place of partial revelation. It shows enough to overturn assumptions, but not enough to explain every motive. It reveals a tradition of building without giving the words that once surrounded it. Seen this way, the site becomes less like a single monument and more like a long conversation carried out in stone. One generation raises pillars, another returns to them. A space is used, changed, filled, or closed. New spaces appear nearby. Animals are carved, walls are repaired, debris accumulates, meaning shifts but does not vanish at once. Over time the hill grows heavier with its own history, until the living place becomes a buried one. The mountain of hidden enclosures is not only an archaeological puzzle, it is evidence that the builders understood the power of return and that some places become important, not because they are built once, but because people keep coming back. At the edge of farming, food is never only food. It is laborisk, memory, generosity, status season, and survival made visible. Around Göbekli Tepe, the traces of meals and animal bones do not simply tell a story of people eating beside a monument. They suggest gatherings in which the preparation and sharing of food may have been woven into the meaning of the place itself. The builders who cut limestone and raised pillars also needed bodies fed by meat, seeds, water, and stored energy. A sacred or symbolic landscape cannot exist apart from stomachs. Every carved fox and standing pillar depends in some practical way on people who hunt, gather, grind, cook, carry, and divide what the land provides. The region surrounding the hill is rich in the wild ancestors of later domesticated plants and animals, but during the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe, the old line between foraging and farming remains blurred. People may gather wild einkorn, wild barley, and other grasses growing across nearby slopes and plains. They may process seeds with grinding stones, pound them into meal, and turn them into simple foods that can be cooked or shared. They hunt gazelle wild cattle, wild sheep, wild boar, and other animals. Some of these species later become central to agricultural life, but at this stage many remain wild. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much cultivation, if any, is involved in the earliest activities at the site. Still, the relationship between people and food resources is clearly changing. One of the striking details from Göbekli Tepe is the abundance of animal bones, especially from wild species. Gazelle bones are particularly common, suggesting large-scale hunting in the wider region. Wild aurochs, the massive ancestors of domestic cattle, also appear in the assemblage, and these animals would have been dangerous to kill. Aurochs are not passive meat packages waiting on the plain. They are powerful, fast, and capable of killing humans. Bringing down such animals requires cooperation, skill, and courage. Their meat, once obtained, could feed many people. Their presence in the remains may point not only to diet, but to social occasions where dangerous animals become part of public display, shared prestige, or ritualized consumption. Feasting is one of the most important possibilities at the site. A feast is different from an ordinary meal. It gathers people beyond daily household needs. It creates obligation and memory. Those who provide food gain honor or influence. Those who receive food become tied into networks of reciprocity. Feasting can settle tensions, mark alliances, celebrate ceremonies, honor the dead, attract workers, and turn labor into something socially meaningful. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence at Göbekli Tepe, but feasting helps connect several parts of the puzzle. The need for labor, The presence of large quantities of animal remains the importance of gathering and the emergence of stronger social ties before full village life dominates the region. The processing of plant foods may be just as important as hunting, though less dramatic to imagine. Grinding stones, plant residues, and related evidence from early Neolithic contexts suggest that wild cereals are being used intensively in the broader world of the site. Harvesting wild grain is hard work. People must know when the seeds ripen where stands are thickest, how to cut or beat the heads, how to carry them, how to dry them, and how to remove husks. Grinding is physically demanding and time-consuming. It leaves marks on tools and bodies. If large gatherings occur at Göbekli Tepe, plant foods may provide steady calories, while meat provides moments of abundance, prestige, and ceremony. Some researchers have also discussed the possibility of fermented drinks or beer-like preparations in early Neolithic feasting contexts, including at Göbekli Tepe, where large stone vessels have drawn attention. This remains debated, and it should not be treated as proven in a simple modern sense. Yet the possibility matters because fermentation changes the social role of grain. Wild cereals would not be only a food to be chewed or cooked, but a substance transformed through waiting, mixing, and controlled decay. If fermented beverages are present at gatherings, they may help intensify social bonds, ceremonial states, and collective memory. The evidence is not decisive, but the idea fits a wider pattern in which food processing becomes more than nutrition. Food also creates time. To hold a gathering, people must plan ahead. Hunters may need to coordinate drives or target migrating animals. Gatherers may need to collect seeds, nuts, fruits, or other resources in advance. Wood must be obtained. Water must be carried. Stone vessels, baskets, skins, and cooking installations must be ready. A large event cannot simply happen without preparation. This means Göbekli Tepe may have drawn not only spontaneous visitors, but organized groups arriving at meaningful times of year. Seasonal abundance could have shaped when people gathered what animals were hunted, what plants were processed, and how long ceremonies or construction efforts could last. The edge of farming is therefore not a quiet boundary. It is a zone of experimentation. People may begin by harvesting wild cereals more intensely because gatherings demand food. Repeated harvesting may encourage attention to the best stands of grain. People may scatter seeds unintentionally near camps or deliberately encourage useful plants. They may return to the same areas year after year, noticing which plants grow well after disturbance. Over many generations, small acts can become large transformations. This does not mean Göbekli Tepe directly causes agriculture. Scholars still debate the relationship between ritual centers and domestication, and the evidence does not allow a single dramatic answer. But the site shows a social environment in which the demands of gathering could increase the value of reliable food sources. Human bodies carry the consequences of this transition. The move toward farming is not simply progress from hunger to plenty. Early agricultural life can bring harder labor, narrower diets, disease risks from denser settlement, and new social inequalities. But before those consequences fully appear, there is a more fluid world in which people are still closely tied to wild landscapes, while beginning to intensify certain practices. Göbekli Tepe belongs to that fluid world. It is not yet surrounded by wheat fields in the later village sense, but neither does it belong to a purely untouched wilderness. It sits in a landscape where human attention is beginning to reshape plant and animal relationships. The meals round the hill may have carried meanings no excavation can fully recover. A shared portion of gazelle meat might renew kinship. The distribution of aurochs meat might mark status. The grinding of grain might prepare not only food but participation. The remains of bones and plant processing do not preserve gestures, songs, taboos, or memories, yet they point towards social life in motion. What survives in the record suggests that the stones are only part of the monument. The gatherings themselves may have been the living architecture, while the pillars served as durable anchors for events that rose and vanished like smoke. In this way, feasting at the edge of farming becomes one of the deepest clues to the site. The builders are not only people who carve symbols, they are people learning how collective labour shared food and meaningful places can reinforce one another. The hill draws people together. Gathered people require food. Food production and sharing strengthen social bonds. Stronger bonds make greater construction possible. The cycle may not be simple, but it is powerful. Long before grain becomes the foundation of states and taxes, it may help feed gatherings beneath wild animal carvings on a limestone ridge. Long before cattle become property, wild aurochs may be hunted and shared in the shadow of pillars. At Göbekli Tepe, the story of civilization begins not with a city wall, but with hands passing food among people who are beginning to build permanence out of return. One of the strangest facts about Göbekli Tepe is that parts of it were not simply abandoned to collapse under wind, rain and time. They appear to have been filled in, covered and sealed by human action. The very spaces that required such effort to create were at some point deliberately buried beneath stone soil debris and the remains of activity. This is not the usual image of ancient ruin, where buildings fall apart because people leave and nature slowly takes control. At Göbekli Tepe, concealment itself becomes part of the story. The builders or later communities connected to them seem to have participated in the closing of spaces that had once stood open and powerful on the hill. The fill inside some enclosures contains limestone rubble, soil, flint tools, animal bones and other material. It does not look like a single clean layer of natural sediment drifting quietly into an unused building. It is dense mixed, and in places clearly the result of a large-scale deposition. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact processes by which each enclosure was filled. Some filling may have been intentional and rapid. Some may have accumulated through repeated use, rebuilding, collapse, cleaning, and later dumping. No single explanation fully accounts for all of the deposits. Yet the pattern is too important to ignore. Parts of the monument were transformed from open interiors into buried chambers, and that transformation helped preserve the pillars with extraordinary force. Deliberate burial raises a difficult question. Why would people cover something they or their predecessors had worked so hard to build? Modern instincts often assume that important monuments are meant to remain visible forever. Kings carve names into cliffs. Temples rise above cities. Tombs are marked by pyramids or mounds. But not all acts of reverence require permanent display. In many cultures, powerful things are hidden, closed, wrapped, buried, or removed from ordinary sight at the end of their use. A space may have a life cycle. It may be opened, used, renewed, and then sealed when its meaning changes. The burial of an enclosure may not be destruction. It may be completion. This possibility is compelling, but it cannot be proven in a simple way. Archaeology can show that fill exists and can study what is inside it, how it was deposited and when it accumulated. It cannot directly recover the thoughts of those who placed the debris. If burial was ritual closure, the ritual itself is gone. If the fill was practical levelling for later construction, the practical decisions survive only as layers. If older enclosures were filled because new forms of building replaced them, the social reasons behind that change remain partly hidden. Scholars still debate how much of the burial should be understood as symbolic and how much as practical site management. In deep prehistory, those categories may not have been separate at all. The materials inside the fill are revealing. Animal bones suggest food consumption and perhaps feasting. Flint tools and debris suggest daily or craft activities. Broken stone and rubble suggest construction destruction or remodeling. In a later city, such mixed deposits might be called refuse, but at a place like Göbekli Tepe, refuse can still be meaningful. The remains of meals, tools, and broken architecture may have been used to close a space because they belong to the life of the site. What modern people call trash may once have been memory. A filled enclosure might contain the physical residue of gatherings, hunts, meals, repairs, and ceremonies all pressed together into a final covering. One lesser-known dimension of the burial is how it complicates conservation and interpretation. The fill protected the pillars from being fully exposed to weather for thousands of years. Carvings that might have eroded away remained hidden in the dark. The mound became a shield. Without the ancient act of covering, much of what makes Göbekli Tepe extraordinary might have been lost long before modern excavation. Yet the same fill also makes the site difficult to understand. It mixes materials from different activities and perhaps different moments. It seals spaces but also obscures their original appearance. The act that preserves the monument also clouds its meaning. There is a quiet irony here. People who may never have intended to leave a message for the distant future ended up preserving one of the most important archaeological sites in the world by burying it. Their reasons may have been local, immediate and meaningful only within their own tradition. They may have closed an enclosure because its time had ended, because a new space was needed, because a ceremony required concealment, because the pillars represented beings who should no longer stand open, or because rebuilding the hill demanded fill. What survives in the record suggests action but not motive. The stones are protected by an ancient decision whose purpose remains out of reach. The burial also changes the emotional atmosphere of the site. An exposed monument speaks of display. A buried monument speaks of withdrawal. The pillars stand in darkness, not in open air. The carved animals vanish from sight. The central figures are enclosed in earth. The hill becomes heavier not only physically but symbolically. If the burial is intentional closure, then each filled enclosure becomes a kind of sealed chamber, not a tomb in the ordinary sense, but a place where architecture is placed beyond daily access. The past is not abandoned, it is covered. This idea connects to broader patterns in Neolithic life, where buildings in some regions are rebuilt, burned, buried, or replaced in ways that suggest structures have social biographies. A house or special building may be born, used, modified, and closed. Materials from older phases may be incorporated into newer ones. The boundary between building and ancestor place and memory object and relationship may be more fluid than modern categories allow. Göbekli Tepe may belong to this wider world of architectural life cycles, though its monumental scale makes the pattern especially dramatic. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the idea of buildings having lives helps make sense of why covering a structure need not mean forgetting it. The gradual transformation of the site may also reflect changing society. As communities in the region move further into Neolithic lifeways, the great circular enclosures may become less central, or their meanings may shift. New forms of settlement, food production, and social organization could change how people use the hill. A sacred landscape that once gathered mobile groups might be reinterpreted by communities becoming more settled. The filling of older spaces may therefore record not only ritual closure but historical transition. The world that built the largest pillars may not be identical to the world that buried them. Yet the burial does not erase the hill from human memory at once. Later activity continues in different forms, and the mound remains part of the landscape. Over long centuries, however, the visible signs fade. The enclosures disappear beneath accumulated deposits. The carved animals no longer face living visitors. the ridge returns to the appearance of ordinary ground. By the time later civilizations rise and pass through the wider region, the oldest chambers are already sealed. The builders have vanished as named people, and their monument has become geology to anyone who does not know where to look. The mystery of deliberate burial is therefore not a side detail. It is central to the power of Göbekli Tepe. The site is not only about construction, it is about transformation. People cut stone from the earth, raise it into meaningful forms, gather around it, and then return it to the earth. The motion is almost circular. Bedrock becomes pillar. Pillar becomes presence. Presence becomes buried memory. Thousands of years later, excavation reverses the movement, bringing the stones back into light. But the reason they were hidden remains one of the hill's most haunting silences, a reminder that ancient people did not always build for permanent visibility. Sometimes they built, gathered, remembered, and then covered what mattered most. To call Göbekli Tepe older than Stonehenge is true, but the comparison can be misleading if it makes the two places seem like different versions of the same idea. Stonehenge rises in southern Britain thousands of years later, within a world of farming communities, long-distance exchange, burial traditions, ceremonial landscapes and astronomical alignments that belong to a very different age. Göbekli Tepe belongs to the early Neolithic of southeastern Anatolia, closer to the beginning of farming than to the world of bronze-written kingdoms or later European megaliths. Both sites use stone to shape memory and gathering. Both alter the landscape in ways that outlast their builders. But they do not come from the same social world, and they should not be forced into one simple category just because they involve standing stones. The age gap is staggering. The earliest monumental enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are more than 11,000 years old. Stonehenge in its major stone phases is roughly 5,000 years old. That means Göbekli Tepe is not just slightly earlier. It is separated from Stonehenge by a span of time longer than the distance between Stonehenge and the modern world. Civilizations rise and fall inside that gap. Farming spreads across Europe. Villages become towns in some regions. Pottery, herding, long-distance exchange networks, and increasingly complex burial traditions reshape human life. By the time Stonehenge takes form, the world has already been transformed by changes that are only beginning in the age of Göbekli Tepe. This difference matters because ancient monuments are often flattened into a single mystery. A circle of stones becomes evidence of one universal ancient obsession, usually imagined as astronomy, lost knowledge, or some hidden global tradition. Such ideas are popular, but they often erase the specific societies that built the monuments. Stonehenge has strong connections to burial landscape processions, seasonal alignments, and Neolithic and Bronze Age communities in Britain. Göbekli Tepe, by contrast, belongs to a world without pottery in its earliest phases, without domesticated herd animals in the later familiar sense, and without settled agricultural life as the unquestioned base of society. No single explanation fully accounts for either site, but their mysteries are not interchangeable. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars are central. They do not resemble the sarsen uprights and lintels of Stonehenge in form or construction logic. They are carved from limestone, shaped into stylized figures, and often covered with animal imagery. Their human-like features, including arms and hands on some examples, suggest that they may represent beings' ancestors or presences rather than simply architectural supports. Stonehenge, on the other hand, uses enormous stones arranged in a way that creates opening sight lines and a monumental geometry tied to a broad ceremonial landscape. Its stones are less figurative. They do not carry the same dense animal reliefs. The meanings of both remain debated, but their visual languages are clearly different. The landscapes are different as well. Stonehenge stands within a wider ritual terrain of avenues, burial mounds, timber circles, earthworks, and nearby settlements such as Durrington Walls. Its story is deeply tied to movement through a ceremonial landscape, to the dead, to seasonal gatherings, and perhaps to the relationship between timber and stone life and ancestry. Göbekli Tepe stands on a limestone ridge above the plains of Upper Mesopotamia, in a region where early Neolithic communities are experimenting with settlement, wild serial use communal buildings and symbolic architecture. Its surrounding world includes quarry areas, other early monumental sites, hunting grounds, and the ecological richness of the Fertile Crescent. The comparison is useful only if it sharpens the differences rather than smoothing them away. One surprising detail is that Göbekli Tepe may have been less concerned with the sky than many popular accounts assume. Because later stone monuments are often discussed through solstices, stars, and alignments, people sometimes try to turn Göbekli Tepe into an astronomical observatory or a coded map of constellations. Some researchers have explored possible celestial meanings, and the night sky surely mattered to ancient people everywhere. But the strongest archaeological evidence at Göbekli Tepe lies in architecture, carving, food remains, quarrying, and communal activity, not in a securely decoded star system. Scholars still debate many possibilities, yet claims that the site preserves precise astronomical messages or records. A global catastrophe often go beyond what the evidence can support. The animals in the stone may have cosmic meanings, but they cannot simply be read as a modern planetarium. The same caution applies to the phrase older than civilization. It is dramatic, but it depends on what civilization means. If civilization means cities, writing states, bureaucracies, and class hierarchies, then Göbekli Tepe is indeed far older than the first urban civilizations. But if civilization is used loosely to mean complex human society, symbolic life, organized labor, and shared tradition, then the site proves that those capacities were already deep in human life. The builders are not civilized in the later Mesopotamian sense, yet they are not simple or undeveloped. They occupy a different form of complexity, one that later historical categories often fail to recognize. Stonehenge also teaches caution in another way. It has been studied for centuries and still its meanings remain incomplete. Archaeology can date stones, trace origins, map alignments, analyze burials and reconstruct parts of the landscape, but it cannot recover the full ceremonial language of its builders. Göbekli Tepe is even older and more distant from written explanation. The temptation to solve it completely is strong, but the responsible interpretation remains layered and careful. What survives in the record suggests gathering symbolism, repeated construction, and powerful relationships between people, animals, and place. Beyond that, certainty fades. Yet the comparison with Stonehenge remains useful because it helps reveal the depth of human monumentality. Long before the stones of Britain are raised, people in southeastern Anatolia are already making landscapes that hold collective meaning. This does not diminish Stonehenge, it expands the story. It shows that megalithic or monumental traditions are not the invention of one region or one moment. Human beings in different places and under different conditions repeatedly discover that stone can carry memory beyond the human lifespan. The form varies, the purpose changes, the impulse to make a place endure appears again and again. Göbekli Tepe is different because it appears so early in the sequence. It rises before many of the social structures once thought necessary for such projects. That is why it continues to unsettle the imagination. Stonehenge can be placed within a world already shaped by farming societies. Göbekli Tepe stands closer to the threshold when older hunting and gathering lifeways are still powerful and new forms of settlement and food use are emerging. It does not fit comfortably into the story of monuments as products of mature agricultural surplus. It suggests that gathering around meaning may have helped create the conditions from which later settled life grew. The phrase older than Stonehenge therefore works best as a doorway, not as an explanation. It invites attention, but the real story lies beyond the comparison. Göbekli Tepe is not impressive because it is a primitive Stonehenge, nor because it anticipates later European stone circles. It is impressive because it belongs to its own world, wild animals carved into limestone stylized pillars, raised on a ridge gatherings at the edge of farming enclosures, built and buried across generations. Its purpose may overlap with later monuments in the broad human need for memory, ceremony, and place, but its specific meaning remains rooted in a vanished Neolithic landscape. The stones of Göbekli Tepe do not stand in a straight ancestral line leading neatly to Stonehenge. They stand as evidence that the human past is wider and stranger than any single timeline. Monumental building does not begin in one place for one reason and then spread like a simple invention. It appears where social life, landscape, belief, labour and memory come together with enough force to change the ground. On a hill in Anatolia thousands of years before the stones of Salisbury Plain are raised, that force is already present. The result is not a familiar monument before its time, but a different kind of beginning. The discovery that changed prehistory did not begin with instant recognition. Göbekli Tepe was not first seen as a world-altering site waiting to overturn old assumptions. It was a mound with stones in a region already rich in ancient remains, a place where fragments appeared on the surface, and where earlier surveys did not immediately grasp the depth of what lay below. This is often how archaeology works. The past does not always announce itself with grandeur. It hides under ordinary ground, among broken tools, field stones, disturbed soil, and misleading appearances. A site can sit in plain view for generations, while its true meaning remains concealed, not because nobody sees it, but because nobody yet knows how to read what is being seen. Local people had long known the hill. Farmers encountered stones while working the land. Some stones were moved broken or reused, as happens in agricultural landscapes across the world. To someone not trained to recognize prehistoric architecture, a carved or shaped limestone block might seem like an inconvenience, a strange old stone among many others. Even professional archaeologists can miss significance when a site does not fit expected patterns. The first impression of Göbekli Tepe did not immediately reveal a monumental pre-pottery Neolithic centre. Its oldest structures were buried. Its pillars were not standing freely above ground. Its mound looked like something that might belong to later periods or contain scattered remnants rather than an immense early Neolithic complex. The turning point came when renewed archaeological attention brought a different eye to the hill. In the 1990s, excavations led by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute began to reveal that the stones were not random fragments. They belonged to large, carefully arranged enclosures far older than anyone would expect from a monumental site of this scale. The T-shaped pillars, animal relief stone walls, and deep deposits began to show a pattern. What had seemed like a modest mound became a doorway into a period that has been poorly represented by monumental architecture. The age of the site, confirmed through archaeological context and dating of associated materials, made the implications impossible to ignore. The discovery did not simply add another famous ruin to the map of ancient wonders. It challenged the mental map of prehistory. For decades, textbooks and public imagination often treated monumental sacred architecture as something that followed agriculture and settlement. People became farmers, built villages, stored surplus, developed hierarchy, and only then created temples. Göbekli Tepe appeared to stand near the beginning of that process rather than at the end. This did not mean every old model had to be thrown away. but it meant the old order was no longer secure. These sites suggested that large-scale ritual or communal construction could exist among communities that were not yet fully agricultural in the later village sense. That realization spread far beyond academic archaeology because it touched a simple and powerful idea: the beginning of civilization might be stranger than expected. The phrase captured public attention, but the scholarly reality was more careful. Göbekli Tepe did not prove that a lost advanced civilization existed before known history. It did not reveal writing, metal machinery, or urban planning from a forgotten empire. What it revealed was more subtle and more important. It showed that hunter-gatherer or early Neolithic communities could organize labor and symbolic architecture at a scale once underestimated. It forced a new respect for societies that had often been described mainly by what they lacked, rather than by what they could create. One lesser-known part of the discovery story is how much interpretation changed after the first major announcements. Early descriptions often emphasized the site as a temple without a settlement, a sacred center used by mobile hunter-gatherers. That image was striking and useful, but later research has made the picture more complex. Evidence from Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites suggests that the boundaries between ritual domestic activity settlement and special architecture may not be as clean as once presented. Archaeologists continue to debate whether people lived near or at parts of the site, how permanent occupation was, and how daily life connected to the enclosures. The discovery changed prehistory, but the interpretation of the discovery has also changed over time. This is important because great archaeological finds often become frozen in their first dramatic public story. A headline is easier to remember than a shifting body of evidence. Yet archaeology is not a single moment of revelation. It is a long process of excavation, dating, comparison, correction, and disagreement. A wall uncovered in one season may change the interpretation of a trench opened years before. New sites in the same region may show that what once seemed unique is part of a broader tradition. Improved scientific methods may refine dates or reveal plant residues, use where microscopic traces and environmental data invisible to earlier researchers. Göbekli Tepe continues to change because the questions asked of it continue to change. The recognition of the site also depended on regional context. Southeastern Anatolia and the broader Upper Mesopotamian world have become increasingly central to understanding the Neolithic transition. Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated miracle. It belongs among other sites that show early architecture, symbolic activity, communal buildings, and changing relationships with plants and animals. When archaeologists compare it with this wider landscape, the site becomes less like an impossible anomaly and more like the most dramatic known expression of a real social transformation. This does not make it less mysterious. It makes the mystery historically deeper because it places the hill within a world of communities experimenting with new ways of gathering and living. The discovery also changed how archaeologists think about visibility. Many early Neolithic communities leave behind modest traces: house foundations, stone tools, hearths, plant remains, burials, and refused deposits. Monumental stone architecture is harder to miss once uncovered, but Göbekli Tepe remained hidden precisely because it had been buried. Its preservation depended on ancient filling and modern recognition. This raises a quiet possibility that other important sites remain concealed under ordinary hills, fields, and mounds across the region. Some have already begun to emerge through survey and excavation. The famous hill may be one part of a wider buried story that is still being mapped. Public fascination with Göbekli Tepe has sometimes pulled it toward exaggerated claims. Because the site is ancient, mysterious, and visually powerful, It attracts speculation about lost civilizations, cosmic warnings, and hidden codes. These ideas can be dramatic, but they usually move far beyond the evidence. The real archaeological discovery is not weaker because it rejects them. It is stronger. The truth does not need a vanished superculture to be astonishing. It is astonishing enough that communities without metal tools and without cities raised carved pillars on a hill thousands of years before Stonehenge. It is astonishing enough that symbolic architecture may have helped shape the social path toward farming and settled life. The discovery that changed prehistory therefore continues to unfold. It is not a single answer dug from the ground, but a continuing disturbance in the old story of human development. Göbekli Tepe reminds archaeology that absence of evidence for complexity is not evidence of simple minds. It reminds history that the most important transformations often begin before writing, before kings, before the categories that later ages used to explain themselves. The hill looked ordinary because its makers left no names above it. Once the stones came back into the light, they did not speak clearly, but they spoke loudly enough to change the question. Civilization, it seemed, may have roots not only in the field and the village, but also in the gathering place, the carved animal, the buried enclosure, and the shared labour of people whose world was older than the oldest stories written down. Once Göbekli Tepe comes back into the light, explanation becomes almost as difficult as excavation. The stones are visible, the carvings can be studied, the walls can be traced, the layers can be dated, and the bones and tools can be counted. But the central question remains stubbornly alive. What was this place for? The easiest answers are also the most dangerous because they pretend that a single modern word can contain an entire vanished world. Temple sanctuary, meeting place, cult center, ancestor site, feasting ground, social hub, ritual landscape. Each term catches part of the evidence and loses another part. Göbekli Tepe resists being reduced to one function, because the people who built it may not have separated function in the way modern observers do. A place could be sacred, political, social, seasonal, practical, dangerous, and memorable all at once. The temple interpretation remains one of the most famous. The scale of the enclosures, the central pillars, the animal imagery, and the apparent separation from ordinary domestic architecture all support the idea that Göbekli Tepe held special ritual importance. The T-shaped pillars, especially those with arms and hands, seem like more than construction elements. They may represent stylized human-like beings, ancestors, spirits, or powerful presences. The surrounding animals may form part of a symbolic system tied to myth, death, identity, or the wild world. What survives in the record suggests that people did not build these enclosures merely to shelter themselves from rain. They built spaces that focused attention and carried meanings beyond daily routine. Yet the word temple brings baggage. It can make the mind leap to priests' altars, offerings, doctrines, and gods in forms familiar from later literate civilizations. There is no direct evidence for such institutions at Göbekli Tepe. There are no written prayers, no named deities, no administrative records, no temple economy, and no clear priestly class preserved in the ground. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how organized ritual authority may have been. It is possible that ritual specialists existed. It is also possible that leadership was temporarily shared or tied to particular events rather than permanent offices. The site may be sacred without being a temple in the later Mesopotamian or Egyptian sense. Another explanation focuses on ancestors and the dead. The human-like pillars may stand for important beings remembered across generations, perhaps ancestors transformed into stone, or figures that link the living to those who came before. Some imagery from Göbekli Tepe and related early Neolithic sites has been discussed in connection with death skull treatment and the separation or display of human remains. In the broader Neolithic Near East, human skulls sometimes receive special attention, and the dead can remain deeply involved in the social life of communities. At Göbekli Tepe, direct evidence for burial practices inside the famous enclosures is limited and debated, but the atmosphere of human-shaped pillars surrounded by wild animals has encouraged interpretations connected to mortality, transformation, and memory. This ancestor-focused reading has power because it fits the importance of return. A group that comes back to a hill across generations may not be gathering only for immediate survival. It may be returning to a place where origins are remembered, alliances are renewed, and the dead remain socially present. Monumental pillars can make memory durable. They can create a center where groups define who they are and where they come from. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for the imagery. If ancestors are present in the stones, they are not named. If death rituals occurred, their traces are partial. The site hints at relationships between living bodies, carved bodies, and absent bodies, but it does not allow a complete reconstruction. A third line of interpretation sees Göbekli Tepe as a place of seasonal gathering and social integration. Mobile or semi-mobile groups may have come together at particular times of year, perhaps when wild cereals ripened, animals migrated, or social calendars demanded assembly. At such gatherings, people could exchange goods, find marriage partners settle, disputes, share information, hunt cooperatively, feast, and take part in ceremonies. The monument would then function as a social magnet. Its importance would not lie only in belief, but in the way belief, food, labor, and social connection reinforce one another. This explanation fits the evidence for large-scale labor and food consumption, and it helps explain why people who did not yet live in dense cities might still create monumental architecture. The seasonal gathering idea also explains why the site may not need a permanent town at its earlier stage. A place can be central, even if it is not occupied every day. The most important places in a mobile world are often those to which people return: water sources, hunting grounds, burial places, ceremonial sites, crossings, ridges, caves, and meeting zones. Göbekli Tepe may have been one such anchor intensified through stone, but newer evidence complicates any sharp distinction between gathering site and settlement. Some archaeologists argue that domestic and ritual activities are more intertwined than older interpretations allowed. This site may have included forms of habitation or daily activity alongside special buildings. The debate continues because the categories themselves may be too modern. Group identity offers another important possibility. The animals carved on pillars may mark clans, lineages, mythic affiliations, or communities. Different enclosures might have belonged to different groups or represented different symbolic traditions within a shared ritual landscape. If people came from various territories, the hill could serve as a place where identities were displayed and negotiated. A fox, snake, boar, or bird might not be only an animal. It might signal belonging, origin, obligation, or story. This remains speculative because there is no written key. Yet the repeated and patterned use of animal imagery suggests that the builders were communicating something recognizable to participants. The carvings likely made social sense, even if that sense is now lost. There are also explanations that connect Göbekli Tepe to the rise of agriculture. Some researchers suggest that the need to feed large gatherings may have encouraged more intensive harvesting, processing, and eventual cultivation of wild cereals. Others caution that the transition to farming is too broad and varied to be tied too directly to one site or one kind of ritual. The more careful view is that Göbekli Tepe belongs to the same world of change in which farming emerges, and it may have contributed to that transformation by creating new social demands. ritual did not simply invent agriculture, but gathering, feasting, labour and plant use may have formed feedback loops that helped push communities toward more settled and productive food systems. Fringe and popular theories often enter where uncertainty remains. Some claim the site encodes advanced astronomy, preserves the memory of a comet impact, or proves contact with a lost civilization. These ideas usually gain attention because they offer a clear secret where archaeology offers a difficult conversation. A few specific claims have been debated in public and academic spaces, especially those linking certain carvings to celestial events, but the broader extraordinary claims remain disputed or unsupported. The mainstream mystery is not that ancient people had outside help. It is that ordinary human communities using the knowledge and tools of their time were capable of far more symbolic and organizational complexity than older models assumed. The strongest interpretation may therefore be a layered one. Göbekli Tepe may have been a ritual place, a gathering place, a feasting place, an identity marker, a memory landscape, and a center of labor all at once. Its meaning may have changed across centuries. One enclosure may not have meant exactly what another did. Early builders may have understood the hill differently from later people who filled, modified, or rebuilt parts of it. The site's long life warns against a single frozen explanation. It was not an object with one purpose, it was a place in motion. What remains most important is the shift in perspective. Göbekli Tepe shows that early Neolithic communities were not merely reacting to environmental change or waiting passively for agriculture to transform them. They were actively creating social worlds, organizing gatherings, shaping symbols, and building places that could hold collective memory. The competing explanations in the dust do not cancel one another. They reveal how rich the site is. A simpler monument might have one obvious function. Göbekli Tepe has many possible functions because the world that made it was already complex, and because the stones preserve only the durable edge of meanings that once lived in bodies, voices, gestures, meals, and return. The hill of Göbekli Tepe rises during a time when climate is no longer only a background condition, but one of the great forces shaping human possibility. The world at the end of the Ice Age is unstable, not in the sudden cinematic sense of a single catastrophe swallowing everything, but in the deeper and more relentless sense of environments changing across generations. Cold periods loosen, warmer intervals return, rainfall patterns shift, plant communities move, herds alter their ranges, water becomes dependable in some places and uncertain in others. For communities whose lives depend on wild animals, wild cereals, seasonal plants, and careful movement through the land, such changes do not remain abstract. They enter every meal, every journey, every gathering, and every decision about where to return. The people connected to Göbekli Tepe live near the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent, but the term can mislead if it suggests an easy paradise. Fertility is seasonal, patchy, and fragile. Some slopes may bloom with wild grasses after rain, while nearby ground remains hard and poor. Herds may be abundant one year, and harder to find the next. A spring or stream can become more valuable as conditions dry. The landscape offers opportunity, but it also demands knowledge. People must read it constantly, and the old knowledge passed down from elders may need adjustment as climates shift. What survives in the record suggests a world rich enough to support gathering, yet uncertain enough to make social cooperation increasingly important. The Younger Dryas, a cold and generally drier interval that interrupts the warming trend before the full, Holocene remains one of the most discussed climate events in this story. Its causes and local effects are still studied, and scholars still debate how directly it influenced the beginnings of agriculture in different regions. It would be too simple to say that a climate shock forced people to farm and build monuments. Human societies rarely change for one reason alone, but climate stress can sharpen existing pressures. If wild resources become less predictable, groups may intensify harvesting, strengthen alliances, experiment with storage, return more often to reliable locations, or gather information through wider social networks. In such a world, a place like Göbekli Tepe may serve not only symbolic needs but also social resilience. Hunger is not always visible in archaeology as a dramatic famine layer. More often it appears indirectly through changes in food use, mobility, settlement, and labour. People may broaden their diets, process smaller seeds, hunt different animals, or spend more effort securing resources that once seemed abundant. Grinding stones, animal bones, storage practices, and plant remains become traces of adaptation. Around the early Neolithic, communities in the broader region are beginning to pay closer attention to cereals and other useful plants. Whether this attention begins from abundance, pressure, social demand, or a mixture of all three remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for the transition. The important point is that food strategies are becoming more intensive. Gathering at Göbekli Tepe may have amplified this intensification. A small group can survive by moving lightly through the land, but a large gathering requires concentration of food. People must plan. They must know when gazelle herds pass, where wild grain ripens, how much can be brought, and how long a group can remain. A ceremonial or social event can become a practical challenge that encourages new ways of managing resources. If gatherings happen repeatedly, the demand becomes predictable. Over generations, repeated demand may encourage greater attention to the plants and animals that feed the gathering. This does not make ritual the sole cause of farming, but it shows how symbolic life and subsistence can become entangled. The transition to farming itself is not a clean invention. It unfolds through long relationships with wild species. Wild cereals gathered year after year may begin to change under human selection, especially when people favor plants with larger seeds or heads that do not shatter easily. Animals hunted regularly may later become managed, penned, or gradually domesticated. These processes differ by species and region, and they take time. Early communities may not set out to create agriculture as later people understand it. They may simply try to make life more reliable, to feed gatherings, to stay longer in good places, or to reduce the risks of uncertain seasons. The consequences become much larger than the intentions. One lesser-known and important detail is that the earliest farming was not immediately easier than foraging. Later romantic stories sometimes imagine agriculture as an obvious improvement, but the first farmers often face heavier labour, narrower diets, greater exposure to disease in denser settlements, and new dependencies on crops that can fail. The shift may have been attractive, not because it made every life better at once, but because it supported larger communities, more predictable food stores, stronger claims to place, and new social systems. Göbekli Tepe stands near the beginning of this difficult bargain. Its builders may still know the freedom and skill of foraging lifeways, while also participating in social patterns that make more settled living increasingly likely. Climate also affects imagination. A changing landscape can make memory more important. If older hunting routes become less reliable, people may gather to share news. If certain places remain productive, they may become anchors of identity. If the world seems to change beyond the span of one-life stories about origins, animals, ancestors, and sacred places may help communities make sense of instability. The carved animals at Göbekli Tepe may not be climate records in a literal sense, but they belong to a world where humans are watching animals and environments closely. The wild creatures in stone are part of a mental landscape shaped by dependence on the living world. The hill's position may have made it a natural focus during this era of change. From the ridge, the surrounding plain and distant landscapes can be seen in broad sweep. This site sits near resources but above them, not hidden within one narrow ecological niche. It could gather people from different territories whose knowledge and experiences varied. In uncertain times, such gatherings may help communities compare conditions across the region. A hunter from one area may know where herds have moved. A gatherer from another may know which slopes carry grain. A family from farther away may bring news of water conflict, disease, or opportunity. Ritual and information exchange may have been inseparable. The consequences of these changes stretch far beyond the hill. Across the broader Fertile Crescent, human communities eventually domesticate plants and animals, build more permanent villages, develop new forms of property, reshape landscapes, and create the long foundations for later urban societies. This transformation is often called the Neolithic Revolution, though the word revolution can hide how slow and uneven it really is. It is not one event. It is a mosaic of local experiments, successes, failures, and adaptations. Göbekli Tepe belongs to one of the most important pieces of that mosaic, because it shows that social and symbolic life are active parts of the process. The climate does not build the pillars. Hunger does not carve foxes into limestone. Wild grain does not arrange central T-shaped figures inside enclosures. Human beings do those things, but they do them within landscapes of pressure and possibility. The changing world at the end of the Ice Age creates conditions in which old lifeways are stretched and new ones become imaginable. People gather more intensely, return to important places, share food, organize labor, and perhaps begin to rely more heavily on certain plants and animals. The hill records this tension in stone. It is not simply a monument beside the birth of agriculture. It is part of the human response to a world where survival, memory, and meaning are all being rearranged. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left no names behind, and that absence is one of the most powerful features of the site. Later monuments often come wrapped in identity. Kings carve their titles into stone. Cities stamp their seals into clay. Dynasties build tombs that insist on memory. Even when later inscriptions are broken, there is often some surviving trace of rank, language, ambition, or ownership. Göbekli Tepe gives almost none of that. It offers pillars, animals, walls, tools, bones, quarries, and buried chambers, but not a single written name for the people who imagined the place. Their lives are visible only through action. They are known by what they made, what they ate, what they carved, what they carried, and what they chose to cover. This anonymity can make them feel distant, but it should not make them feel vague. The people who built the enclosures were real human beings living in small social worlds, filled with kinship, memory, rivalry, fear, skill, affection, grief, and obligation. They woke into weather. They followed paths worn by feet, animals, and habit. They knew the taste of dust and wild grain, the smell of hides and smoke, the danger of a wounded boar, the effort of carrying water uphill, the sharpness of flint, the weight of a child asleep against a shoulder. Archaeology cannot recover these lives in full, yet the material record refuses to reduce them to shadows. Every pillar is a record of bodies at work. The absence of names also changes the meaning of authorship. Modern minds often search for a designer, a founder, a master builder, or a visionary individual. Someone must have imagined the first enclosure. Someone must have known how to cut the stone. Someone must have directed labor when a pillar was raised. Yet Göbekli Tepe probably emerges from collective traditions rather than a single named genius. Knowledge is distributed across groups. One person may understand quarrying, another carving, another ceremonies, another animal movements, another the timing of gatherings. Leadership may have existed, but not necessarily as permanent command. Scholars still debate the social organization behind the site, and the evidence remains incomplete. What survives suggests cooperation without revealing the exact structure of authority. Their bodies may have been shaped by work in ways modern viewers rarely consider. People who live by hunting and gathering often develop strength, endurance, and practical skill through daily activity rather than specialized labor separated from ordinary life. They walk long distances, carry loads, crouch, climb, grind, scrape, cut, and lift. Stoneworking adds another layer of strain. Repeated striking with stone tools stresses hands, wrists, shoulders, and backs. Grinding grain or seeds for long periods leaves traces on muscles and joints. Hunting large animals requires bursts of danger and coordination. The monument is therefore not only an intellectual achievement, it is a physical history, a record of human bodies committing themselves to something that outlasts them. One lesser-known clue to the builder's world comes from the way early Neolithic communities treat the human body after death. Across parts of the Near East, skulls and bones sometimes receive special attention, with practices that may include removal, display plastering, or reburial in later contexts. Göbekli Tepe itself has produced evidence that has been discussed in relation to skull modification and special treatment, though interpretation remains debated. This does not mean the site was simply a cemetery, and direct evidence must be handled carefully. But it suggests that the boundary between the living community and the dead may have been active and emotionally charged. The human-like pillars may have stood within a world where ancestors' memory and bodily remains carried deep significance. The people who built the site also lived in a social landscape that was probably larger than a single camp. Materials, ideas, and styles moved across regions. Communities may have known distant groups through seasonal meetings. Marriage ties, shared ceremonies, exchange routes, and stories carried from one place to another. A person arriving at Göbekli Tepe may have recognized some symbols and found others unfamiliar. The hill may have been a place where identities were both reinforced and negotiated. A carving might tell one group that it belongs, and another that it is entering a powerful space, governed by traditions older than the present gathering. Children would have been part of this world even if their traces are harder to see. They may have watched adults carve, hunt, prepare food, sing, mourn, or move stones. They may have learned the animals of the pillars before they fully understood the stories attached to them. They may have carried small loads, gathered fuel, fetched water, or played near construction debris while adults performed tasks that seemed both ordinary and immense. Prehistoric monuments are often imagined as adult achievements, but traditions survive because young people absorb them. A child who sees a pillar raised may later become an elder who remembers when that stone first stood. Women too must be brought back into the picture carefully, because older reconstructions of monumental labour often defaulted to male hunters and male builders as if they alone made society. The evidence at Göbekli Tepe does not allow a neat division of tasks by gender. Hunting large animals, quarrying, carving, grinding food, preparation, ritual participation, plant gathering, and social organisation may have involved different people in different ways. Some tasks may have been gendered, others may not. What can be said is that a site requiring food, labour, memory, and gathering cannot be understood through only one kind of participant. The hidden work behind the stones includes the full social body, not merely the hands that struck limestone. The builders also left no obvious signs of kingship. There are no palaces, royal tombs, or inscriptions claiming the labour of others. That does not mean the society was perfectly equal. Status differences can exist without kings, and influence may be expressed through feasting, ritual, knowledge, hunting, success, age, kinship, or control of gatherings. Some individuals or groups may have gained prestige by organising work or providing food. others may have held special knowledge of the carvings and ceremonies. No single explanation fully accounts for how power operated here. The absence of kings does not mean the absence of leadership. It means leadership was not preserved in the forms later history expects. This is why the builders are so difficult to place in the common story of civilization. They are not citizens, peasants, priests, or soldiers. They are not subjects of a state. They do not leave behind laws, tax records, or dynastic lists. Yet they are not simple wanderers outside history. They create durable architecture, organize repeated gatherings, develop a powerful symbolic language, and shape a ridge into a place of memory. They belong to a kind of society that modern categories often handle poorly. Complex, capable, deeply social but not urban. Monumental but not imperial. Spiritually rich perhaps but not explained by scripture. The people behind the stones vanish as individuals, but their anonymity may be part of the lesson. Human history is usually told through names when names survive, yet most of the past was made by people whose names are gone. The makers of Göbekli Tepe stand for that immense majority. Their work reminds us that the foundations of later civilization were not laid only by famous rulers or literate elites. They were laid by unnamed communities who learned to gather, remember, cooperate, and transform landscape into meaning. On the hill the builders disappear, but the act of building remains. In that silence they become both absent and unmistakably present. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe does not remain buried inside the hill. Once the stones are recognized for what they are, they begin to reshape the way the modern world imagines the deep past. The site does not offer a finished answer to the origins of civilization, and that is part of its strength. Instead, it alters the questions. It forces archaeology, history, and anthropology to look again at the long period before cities, before writing, before states, and before the neat categories that later civilizations leave behind. A ridge that once gathered early Neolithic communities now gathers arguments, theories, doubts, and wonder. Its pillars stand not only as monuments from the past, but as tools for changing how the past is understood. For a long time, the birth of complex society was often explained through a practical chain of necessity. Farming came first. Farming produced surplus. Surplus supported population growth, specialization, leadership, ritual, institutions, and eventually cities. This model was never completely simple among specialists, but it became powerful in public imagination because it made human development feel orderly. Göbekli Tepe disturbs that order. It shows that monumental construction and elaborate symbolic life were already present near the beginning of the Neolithic transformation, when communities were still closely tied to wild animals, wild plants, and older forms of mobility. The old model does not vanish, but it becomes less rigid. Agriculture is still crucial, yet it is no longer the only engine in the story. The site's legacy is especially important because it restores agency to people who lived before writing. Prehistoric communities are often described through absence: no metal, no pottery. In the earliest phases, no cities, no writing, no domestic animals in the later familiar sense. These absences are real, but they can become misleading if they define people only by what they did not have. Göbekli Tepe makes absence less important than achievement. Without metal, people cut limestone. Without writing, they preserve symbols. Without kings, they organize labor. Without cities, they create a place that draws repeated gathering across time. What survives in the record suggests not a primitive emptiness, but a different form of complexity. This changes how archaeologists think about religion and social life. Ritual can no longer be treated merely as a luxury that appears after practical needs are solved. At Göbekli Tepe, ritual, if that is the right word, appears deeply entangled with food, labor, identity, and landscape. The enclosures may have helped people gather. Gatherings may have encouraged feasting. Feasting may have strengthened alliances. Alliances may have made larger labor projects possible. Larger projects may have made the place more important, drawing still more return. No single explanation fully accounts for this cycle, but the hill shows that belief and cooperation can be historical forces in their own right. Human societies are not built only by hunger, they are also built by memory obligation and shared imagination. The legacy also extends into the study of farming. Göbekli Tepe sits near the region where some of the world's earliest domesticated cereals and animals eventually emerge. It does not prove that monuments caused agriculture, and careful scholars avoid that kind of simple reversal. But it does suggest that the path toward farming may have been shaped by social demand as much as environmental opportunity. People may have intensified wild grain use partly because gatherings required food. They may have returned to productive areas because important social events occurred there. They may have begun to reshape plants and animals not through one grand invention, but through repeated acts tied to feasts, labor seasonality, and place. The origin of farming becomes less like a purely economic decision and more like a social transformation. Modern fields around the ancient hill give this legacy a quiet irony. Today, agriculture dominates much of the surrounding landscape in ways the earliest builders could not have known. Wheat fields, villages, roads, fences, and modern infrastructure exist in the same broad region where wild cereals once ripened under the attention of foragers and early cultivators. The world that later farming creates now surrounds a monument from the time when that world was just beginning to take shape. The hill stands beneath the sky as a reminder that agriculture was not simply discovered and adopted overnight. It grew from long relationships between people, plants, animals, climate, and social need. Göbekli Tepe has also become a symbol for Turkey and for global heritage. Its protection, presentation, and tourism bring new opportunities and new pressures. A site that slept under the ground for millennia now receives visitors from around the world. Walkways, shelters, and conservation measures help protect exposed structures while also changing the experience of the place. Archaeologists must balance public interest with the slow demands of research. The more famous the site becomes, the more vulnerable it can be to oversimplification. A place of careful evidence can quickly become a stage for exaggerated mysteries. The legacy of the hill therefore depends not only on excavation but on interpretation. This is why the broader Taştepeler region has become so important. Göbekli Tepe is no longer understood as a lone marvel standing outside a wider context. Nearby and related sites reveal that early monumental and symbolic architecture was part of a regional world of experimentation. This does not make Göbekli Tepe ordinary. It makes it historically richer. A single, impossible-looking site can be dismissed as an anomaly, but a network of related sites points toward a genuine cultural landscape. The legacy shifts from one mysterious hill to an entire region, where human communities are reimagining settlement, ritual, and social organization at the dawn of the Neolithic. At the same time, Göbekli Tepe reminds modern observers that heritage is fragile. The exposed stones have survived more than 11,000 years, partly because they were buried. Once uncovered, they enter a new danger. Weathering tourism, temperature changes human contact and the pressures of fame. Preservation becomes another chapter in the life of the site. Ancient people cut and covered the stones. Modern people uncover and shelter them. Future generations will judge whether the present age understood the responsibility of bringing such a place back into light. The deepest legacy of Göbekli Tepe may be humility. It shows that the human past is not a straight road leading neatly from simple foragers to superior civilizations. It is a branching landscape of experiments, losses, forgotten traditions, and forms of intelligence that do not always leave writing behind. The builders of the hill did not need to become like later urban people in order to matter. They mattered because they changed their landscape with shared meaning. They mattered because they stood at a threshold and made stone speak for a world that had no script. Beneath modern fields, roads, and arguments, that legacy remains. Civilization is not born from one invention alone, but from the long human effort to gather, remember, and make a place endure. Even after the hill has been excavated, mapped, photographed, protected, argued over, and drawn into the larger story of the Neolithic world, Göbekli Tepe still refuses to become simple. Its stones have returned to daylight, but the meanings that once surrounded them remain mostly beyond reach. The site gives enough evidence to be transformative, yet not enough to be fully translated. It is possible to describe the pillars, identify many of the animals, analyze the bones, trace the walls, date the deposits, and compare the architecture with other early Neolithic sites. It is much harder to say what the builders believed they were doing when they entered those enclosures, when they touched the stone, when they carved a fox or snake into a pillar, when they filled an old space and walked away. That refusal is not a failure of archaeology. It is the nature of deep time. Writing has not yet arrived to capture names, myths, songs, prohibitions, origin stories, or explanations. The people of Göbekli Tepe may have lived within a symbolic world as rich as any later civilization, but most of it was carried in voices, gestures, ceremonies, memories, and bodies. Those things vanish easily. Stone endures, but it endures silently. A carved scorpion can remain recognizable for more than 11,000 years, while the story that made it powerful can disappear within a few generations if no one remains to tell it. The evidence remains incomplete, not because the site is empty, but because the most human parts of its meaning were never made to survive in the ways modern people expect. The central T-shaped pillars remain the greatest silence. They seem almost human, especially when arms, hands, belts, or clothing-like details appear on them. Yet they do not have faces. This absence gives them a strange authority. A face would invite recognition, emotion, and identity. Without faces, the figures become more distant, perhaps more powerful. They may represent ancestors, supernatural beings, ritual persons, social groups, or presences that do not match modern categories. Scholars still debate their meaning, and no single explanation fully accounts for their form. They stand upright like bodies, but they are not portraits. They occupy the enclosures like participants, but they do not speak. Their anonymity mirrors the anonymity of the builders themselves. The animals are equally resistant. They can be named in many cases, but naming is not understanding. A fox is a fox, but it may also be a lineage, a mythic figure, a seasonal sign, a dangerous power, a joke, a warning, a memory, or a being from a story whose shape has vanished. A snake can mark fear, renewal, movement, underworld associations, or nothing that later symbolism would predict. A vulture can evoke death to modern interpreters, and perhaps it did then, but certainty slips away. The carved creatures show that the builders organized meaning through the wild world, yet the exact grammar of that symbolic language has been lost. The stones preserve vocabulary without syntax. The buried enclosures deepen the problem. If parts of the site were deliberately covered, the act may have been practical, ritual, commemorative, or all of these at once. Modern distinctions between sacred and useful refuse and offering construction and closure may not apply cleanly. The fill inside the enclosures contains bones, rubble tools, and debris, but those materials can be read in more than one way. They may be waste from gatherings, material used to seal a space residue from rebuilding, or traces of actions whose meanings are no longer visible. What survives in the record suggests deliberate transformation, but motive remains hidden. The hill gives the result, not the reason. Even the site's role in the birth of farming remains unresolved. Göbekli Tepe stands close to one of the great turning points in human history, the movement from foraging lifeways toward agriculture settlement and eventually urban civilization. It is tempting to make the hill the key that unlocks the entire transition. Ritual gathers people. Gathered people need food. Food demand encourages cultivation. Cultivation leads to farming. Farming leads to villages. Villages lead to cities. The chain is elegant, and parts of it may be true, but the real process is more tangled. Climate, plant ecology, population, storage, social networks, risk, labour and tradition all play roles. Göbekli Tepe is part of the transformation, not a single cause that explains it. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the site. Human history rarely begins with one invention or one decision. It begins in overlapping changes that only later look like a path. People gather for reasons they understand within their own world. They hunt, carve, feast, remember, return and build. They do not know they are living at the dawn of the Neolithic transformation. They do not know that later scholars will use terms like pre-pottery domestication, monumentality, ritual economy, or social complexity. They're not trying to become ancestors of civilization. They're trying to live meaningfully in their own changing landscape. The future grows from those actions, but it is not visible to them as a destiny. The power of Göbekli Tepe lies in this tension between clarity and mystery. The clear part is already extraordinary. Humans in this region more than 11,000 years ago organized large-scale construction, carve symbolic animals, raise human-like pillars, gather food and create a monumental landscape before the rise of cities and writing. That can be said with confidence. The mysterious part is what these actions meant to the people themselves. Here, certainty must soften. The site may have been a sanctuary, a gathering centre, a place of ancestors, a stage for feasting, a landscape of identity, a setting for ceremonies tied to death, animals, seasons, or stories. It may have been several of these across time. It may have been something for which modern language has no exact word. Popular imagination often wants the stones to reveal a final secret, a lost civilization, a hidden code, a warning from the sky, a forgotten science. But the real secret may be more difficult and more humbling. The builders were not primitive people waiting for civilization to arrive, and they were not members of an impossible advanced empire erased from history. They were human communities at a threshold capable of cooperation, abstraction, artistry, discipline, and memory. Their world was not ours, but it was not lesser. It was dense with meanings that did not need writing to be real. The unsupported fantasies around Göbekli Tepe often make the past smaller by replacing human achievement with outside explanations. The evidence carefully read makes the past larger. What the stones still refuse to say is exactly why they were raised and exactly why they were buried. Yet perhaps that refusal is why the hill remains so powerful. Complete answers can close a subject. Göbekli Tepe stays open. It forces each generation to confront the limits of its own imagination. It asks whether civilization should be defined only by cities, rulers, and writing, or whether it also begins wherever people gather to make shared memory durable. It asks whether the sacred, the social, and the practical were ever truly separate at the beginning. It asks how much of human life has vanished simply because it was carried in forms that time does not preserve. The hill that once looked ordinary has become one of the most important thresholds in archaeology. It does not give a clean origin story. It gives something better, a glimpse of humans becoming increasingly bound to place symbol labour in one another. The structure older than Stonehenge stands not as a solved riddle, but as a reminder that the beginning of civilization was not a straight road from hunger to harvest to empire. It was a long, uncertain gathering around landscapes that mattered around animals that carried meaning around stones that turned memory into weight. And beneath all the debate, the pillars remain where the builders placed them, facing inward, silent, and still holding back the final words. The hill grows quiet again when the questions fade. The wind moves over the ridge as it must have moved long before any excavation trench opened, long before names were given to periods, cultures and phases, long before stone pillars became evidence in a modern argument about the beginning of civilization. The landscape does not explain itself. It simply holds what has happened there. Dust settles in small hollows. Light moves across limestone. The distant plain softens in the evening, and the enclosures seem less like puzzles and more like remnants of human attention, preserved beyond all ordinary memory. Göbekli Tepe remains powerful because it belongs to a time when so much is close to vanishing and close to beginning. The old world of mobile hunters, wild herds, seasonal plants, and stories carried by voice still lives around it. The newer world of settlement cultivation, stored grain, and permanent architecture is beginning to take shape nearby. The people of the hill stand between these worlds without knowing that later ages will call them transitional. They do not leave a written explanation because writing does not yet belong to their world. Instead, they leave weight. They leave shaped stone. They leave animals cut into pale surfaces. They leave spaces built, used, changed, and buried. After thousands of years, only fragments remain, but fragments are sometimes enough. A fox in limestone can show that imagination was present. A quarry scar can show that labor was organized. A buried enclosure can show that memory was treated with care, even if the reason for that care is lost. The site does not need to surrender every secret to matter. Its silence is part of its meaning. It reminds the present that most human lives pass without inscription, without monument, without a name that survives, and yet they still shape the world that follows. So the hill returns to stillness, no longer completely hidden, yet never completely revealed. The pillars stand like figures from a dream that belongs to no single person anymore. Around them the animals remain alert in stone, carrying meanings that time has thinned but not erased. Beyond the ridge fields and roads, cross the land where wild grasses once ripened under ancient skies. The story does not end with certainty. It ends with a place, a silence, and the image of human hands lifting stone into the light, then covering it again for the long sleep of the earth.